Hello everyone. So today's lecture is a continuation of our previous discussion of two concepts. One is marginality and the second is utility. So first I'm going to begin with utility because it's a fairly complicated concept. If you remember, we were using this idea of utility or utils as a measure of utility. And then if you asked, okay, utils is a measure of utility, what is utility that I'm measuring? Right? Your answer is, well, utility is whatever you want it to be in terms of your own personal psychic decisions and pleasure in relation to what makes you feel happy or worth spending money on. So there is something oddly circular about the idea that you buy things based on your utility, and your utility is a measure of what you are willing to spend money on, right? And this circularity has a deep philosophical implication when you move from positive to normative economics, and also when you do positive economics. Some of these implications are beyond this level for us to look at. But just so you pay attention to this concept of utility came from Bentham and what came to be called the British utilitarians. Utilitarians. And these were like people who were trying to use numbers as a way to measure something about human psyche, human behavior, human decisions. And just so we think about what that means, for those of you who are interested, I teach a course called Gender and the Politics of Numbers. And that's gender specific, but the whole idea of a politics of numbers is quite massive in terms of more contemporary efforts to understand what's going on. Veena Das, a very famous medical anthropologist, once noted, we live in an enumerative world. We live in a world where, for various cultural reasons, we are both frightened of numbers and we give them more credence than we need to. And this is a dangerous combination because there are times when we need to pay attention to numbers, such as you need to pay attention to CDC figures on COVID, on death, disease, mortality. And you get scared about that because you suddenly decide, ooh, who can trust numbers? Conversely, we should not trust certain kinds of numbers that have to do with, don't worry, we're going to solve the climate crisis, the profit rates are showing it's all fine. And you're going to have to ask questions such as, well, what's the carbon numbers, right? So part of what's at stake is that we live in a world where we aren't sure how to deal with numbers. We give them a lot of importance, and we kind of feel that our arguments are better if we have more numbers. So whoever has got the most statistics wins, you know. On the other hand, we don't often understand that. And so we treat numbers like kind of what Veena Das's point about enumerate societies. We don't treat them like meaningful. We treat them like political weapons. We treat them like, I got 5 numbers. You got two numbers. You only had one number. Your number had like huge margins of error. Mine had 3 decimal points, right? One of the really valuable things that we do as interdisciplinary scholars, and if you're specifically interested in this, we have an entire degree called Mathematical Thinking Data Visualization, where we look at this. What are numbers? How do they work? If you ever do any work in IAS or in business or in STEM, we spend a lot of time helping you think about numbers and what they mean. And this little reminder is to remind us this idea of utils. You have to spend a ton of time figuring out the status of that number. What does that number mean? Who made it up? Where did it come from? What does it even mean? What does it mean? Anything before you decide to use it to assess, remember, our goals of economics? Efficiency. So one of the first things I want to flag for us is that our theory of markets and our theory of demand depends on this idea that people maximize utility. And there's deep philosophical debates about what that is, how to measure it, what it means, A. And B, to remind you that that word utility is not the same thing as what's useful. When I say something has utility for you, all I mean is that it is something that satisfies your desires. It doesn't mean it's useful in some social sense. It means you want it in some personal sense. The market mechanism allows you to signal your utility preferences through prices based on, just to remind you, that marginal idea, which is the second piece we're going to come to, marginal utility equal to price. That idea that the price you pay for a good is the equivalent of the marginal utility of the good. You're not going to pay for something if it does not give you utility, particularly marginal utility. And if it gives you utility, you'll pay for it. That's what you want. So sometimes actually there is a Latin phrase called de gustibus is non disputandum. I can try and spell it. But what it means is taste has no disputation. You cannot argue about taste. People like some things. Some people like childcare, some people like carbon taxes, some people like fuels, some people like porn, whatever, right? The market's really good at addressing, sending resources and goods to whatever floats your boat. And just to remind you, for some people this is really important. If you live in a world where your sexuality is threatened, where your tastes are constantly monitored, where your gender performance is constantly looked at, being free from restraint is really important. I don't want to denigrate that. On the other hand, if you live in a world where resources, it's not that you're against others, but resources are so busy just going to the people who can afford the 5th yacht, the 10th TV, the 5th, 6th, 8th, 10th designer jeans, and you're like desperate for your kids, you might wonder whether this is the best thing to look at. And the difficulty is, as long as we use efficiency by itself, we don't have a basis for what I like to think of as what economics can give you, which is a basis for a conversation. Because I really think that if we had a conversation, what's the balance you want between efficiency and equity, between efficiency and sustainability, I think you will actually get some pretty good conversations and pretty good people engaging each other. So the first thing I want to end with is, we're anxious about the nature of this concept of utility because it is the primary measure of efficiency, and many of us are not sure if that's the best measure to use. At the same time, we don't want to denigrate it because we value this idea that what people want does have a place in our decision making. We live in a society that has for so long penalized people for being different, for wanting different things, for not having the right desires, for not wanting the most moral stuff, that there's something really valuable about that. My hope is that by thinking about economics as a conversational space, you can think about what can we balance to have a conversation between utility and other things. But this is the idea of utility. This ends this mini lecture on the pros and cons of using utility for one of our measures.